Is it facing me? Can they see me?
No.
No.
There we
There
go.
I am.
There you is.
Should we turn it a little more? Yes, that's better. Okay, good.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, so you take your seats. I was just telling everybody, we're going to start this class with the new sheet. And then we'll go back to that second sheet. You know, it's funny, there's like so many. Well, I thought we'd do the politics first, you know, what's going on in the government at the time. And then we'll talk about the different movements. There's so many movements that are going to come to the fore. Obviously, we're going to do the Haskalah, you know, that's, you know, the Enlightenment. But then we have to also, at some point, we'll start talking about socialism and the Bundist movement, you know, and then the later part, we'll talk about, you know, the rise of Zionism. So they're like all sorts of movements that are all going to come to the fore. So I'm doing the one that, so it says at the top, the Pale of Seven, and then says Tsar Alexander II. So we had started talking about him last time, okay? So those of you, if at all you want to try to correlate it. So the one that says the Haskalah, that was from last week, okay? So it would be on page 2, all right? So that's sort of we were up to. Okay. We'll get to page 2. I'll do that, but let's just backtrack slightly and talk a little bit more about Alexander II. And what was it like for the Jews living under his reign? Okay. In the year 1855, Tsar Nicholas I died. That was his father. Shortly after the end of the Crimean War. Now, we really haven't talked about the. Hey, take a sheet. Don't forget. We haven't really talked about the Crimean War yet, but apparently that made a pretty major impact in those last years of Nicholas the First reign. So the Crimean War, I put down the dates here, it's 1853 to 1854, all right? And look, you'll see that he dies then, Nicholas dies in 1855. But the Crimean War was actually a disaster for Russia, all right? But basically, well, you might know more about the Crimean War. I mean, it's famous for Florence Nightingale, you know, this is where the movement for the Red Cross, it all begins in the Crimean War. And it was a European war, the US wasn't really involved. I'm pretty sure Florence Nightingale actually came from England. Clara Barton, right? She's you think from the American Red Cross, right? Anyways, so this is again, the Crimean War will have an impact on Russia. Again, they're going to be defeated in this war, and so it's a big letdown for everyone here. They thought themselves this mighty empire, and yet, you know, in the end, they were not successful. Okay, all right. So you with me? Okay. So I'm now in the second sentence of that paragraph. As a direct result of inefficiency and corruption in high places. So there's always will refer back negatively then to the Tsar after he's in charge of the entire. Yeah, please help yourself. Each take a sheet. Okay, so where are you? Okay, I'm reading from this.
Yeah, well,
yes, so I'm on that I just finished the second sentence in the first paragraph. We're going to talk about more about Alexander II. Okay. So again, because, you know, I tell you really, this was a terrible defeat, reflects very poorly on the Russian Empire. It says, so the Russian people were shaken to their depths. You know, here they thought they were such a powerful, you know, nation with this powerful army, and here they are defeated. Okay. And there was a revulsion against the sterile, fancy words here, against the sterile apparatus of repression, which now began to sweep through the country. So now they're going to come down very harshly on the people, you know, tried any reforms. And although Nicholas, of course, was a horrible czar, it's a certain vis-a-vis the Jews, but obviously he wasn't good for the regular population either. There's You know, there were never, unfortunately, there were defeats, you're always looking to blame. Again, they went through a period of repression, all right? And in the midst of this growing unrest, all right, Nicholas the First dies, and out the news is Alexander the Second. He ascends to the throne. Immediately, all right, so here, Robert Green, since you just walked in. So then I started the new sheets, and then we'll go back to the sheets from last week. So I'm still in that first paragraph, right where it says, I underline Alexander the Second, so the sentence right after that. So Alexander the Second ascended to the throne. Immediately following his coronation, Alexander, so he's going to start off sounding like a wonderful change from that awful Nicholas the First. And the people are going to be very excited, and the Jews in particular, things are going to ease up for us. Right. So he issued a proclamation that it was his intention to provide education, equal justice, tolerance, and humaneness for every citizen in Russia. So you can imagine how everybody's going to react to this, and the Jews also, of course. Wherever the 37-year-old Tsar went, he was cheered enthusiastically. Said, "Oh, Ray, new regime, new changes." Hardly had he moved into the royal palace in St. Petersburg that he was acclaimed as the Tsar Liberator. So that comes down from history with this sort of title. By ecstatic crowds milling in the public square below. All right, second paragraph. You with me? All right. I'm not sure where. Okay, I'm on page 1, the first page, but the second paragraph. So go. Okay. Alexander the Second was a vaguely good-hearted man. He had been influenced by the humanitarian ideals of his tutor. Shows the influence of a teacher, right? I mean, especially on young minds, right? But like Alexander the First, he was at cross purposes with himself. Here he's been exposed to new ideas and tolerance and everyone equally. But on the other hand, there's the Tsar of the Russian Empire, and they tend to be pretty reactionary. So he's got these conflicting, two streams of thought running through him. Fundamentally, he had little real sympathy for the cause of liberalism. Now he's spouting this, he's saying it, but he doesn't really believe in it. Throughout his reign, he maintained a police regime of exceptional severity. So we talk about the KGB or whatever, the antecedents are in Tsarist Russia. Like, it doesn't change. And he was just different initials describing the secret police. He was responsible for sending thousands of people into Siberian exile. I'm not talking about Jews necessarily, where maybe there were Jews among them, but just the general population. He was responsible for, all right, without the formality of a trial. At least in Russia, I mean, they do put on these show trials. We know what the outcome is, from the get-go. But all right, at least some semblance, for the public. Whatever liberal measures he enacted during the early years of his reign, and you'll learn, it's like the first 8 years. First 8 years that he becomes the Tsar of Russia, it looks like things are turning to the good. But all these changes, right, they were made grudgingly as half-hearted concessions to a dangerously disaffected people. He's dealing with a very tenuous situation. The people, will now be clamoring for more liberal policies, but he's going to come down, you'll see, very heavily against that, after, again, those first 8 years. Even these reforms were best half measures of exasperating incompleteness. And I will see what were some of these measures that are passed, again, in the first 8 years of his reign. No one could predict that the Tsar would ultimately reverse himself. So in the first half of his reign, the censorship of the press was relaxed. That sounds good. Virtually all restrictions on foreign travel were removed. Apparently, you couldn't just travel to another country, in early days. But now, with Obviously, if you could afford it, it's more possible. And the third section, again, this is going to be what will ultimately be like when we take a look at page B. This is the secret police. The third section of the Ministry of Interior was deprived of its power and authority. And universities, now this will be good for the Jews. Universities were open to students drawn from all economic groups. So obviously, depending on you were a good student, you showed promise, you had that possibility of going to the university. In 1861, I just think, whenever I see these dates from those early 1860s, this is the time period of the Civil War in the United States. So just, try to visual. But now we're in Russia. Alexander turned his attention to Russia's 47 million serfs. Oh my God, that's a huge number. And he granted, we'll just get to the right sheet here, sorry. These peasants their legal freedom. Now we'll see, you can always put that in quotation marks, what kind of freedom do they really get? Like on paper. He freed the serfs. It sounded good. At the same time, he compensated the land. But you'll see, it's very complicated. Okay, free the serfs. Meanwhile, look, even think of the United States. Oh, the slaves were freed. Okay, but then what? What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to the landowners? It's complicated. So he frees the serfs, right, officially, right? But at the same time, he compensated the landowners with funds raised by a huge bond issue. Okay, well, who's going to pay for this now? Unfortunately, the peasants were not permitted to own their own plots of land, except as cooperative members of a mir, a collective farm. So when the Soviets come to power and they have all these collective farms, it wasn't something new that they were inventing. It was already had been even in Tsarist time, at this time of Alexander II, this concept, this idea that you're not owning your own property, you're working together. And again, that was called the mir. There were other reforms too. Representative government was cautiously, very tiny little steps, introduced through a system of advisory local assemblies, and these were called zemstar. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. I don't know Russian. Okay. And the judicial system was reconstructed along Western lines. And jury trials were permitted for the first time in Russian history. So you can imagine the people are so excited to see all these wonderful changes happening. There's going to be this growth of liberalism at this time, and they think, oh, all these opportunities are opening up for us. Isn't this wonderful? Military service was also reduced from 25 years. Now remember, we talked about the cantonists. Those are the Jewish children that were trapped, right? From the time that they were 12 years old to be put in these special barracks to be indoctrinated with Christianity. And then when they reached the age of 18, just like all Russian young men, you would be conscripted to the army. But then you were to serve a period of 25 years in the army. It wasn't just for Jews, it was like everybody. Okay, so during this time period of Alexander II, all right, military service is reduced from 25 years to a maximum of 6 years. Like in Israel today, you go for 3 years, for military training. And now, unfortunately, with the war, with the reservists, I mean, that's why they keep on calling extending people's stay. And that's why there's, I think, right now, a greater clamor that the Haredim, why shouldn't they participate in their country? They're the benefits of, So
My family.
well, I've got a mixture. My brother's very frum. He was a rebbe, in Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne for many, many years. So his firstborn's a son, and then he had 4 daughters. So the son is part of that Haredi crowd. Actually, his wife is not expecting baby number 9. But his sons, he says to his big boys, the oldest ones, they go to Panovich. They don't go into army. They're sitting and learning. I think they're serious learners. I don't think they're goofing off, but but his daughters, it's so interesting. Maybe it was my sister-in-law's influence. You know, they went to Michlala, and then they went to college. Not the
Oh, they
regular
have to,
college. I know they have all different names, places. I forget where it was they went to school. And they even have master's degrees. And they all married guys who were in the army. You know, and served in the army. That's interesting. So there's like a real dichotomy in the family. They all get along very beautifully. But you know, but my heart goes out for right now, you know. I mean, I was just reading that it's been the 900s already. It's how many young Israeli men, some that are a little older, have been killed. Right? Yeah, I know, just awful. You know, like when a young man reaches the age of 18 and is conscripted into Tzahal, like everyone's so happy and proud, and you know, they go to these special tekas, you know, installation ceremonies, but you don't know what's ultimately was. Can you imagine when you open the door, just like in America, like during our various wars, and these three officers standing there saying, you know, I remember reading a book. I believe it was written by David Gross. This is Israeli author. I'm not sure if he's still living or not. In any case, I think it was called To the Ends of the Earth. He writes it from the perspective of a mother whose child, right? He's 18 and he's going into the army, and she fears getting that knock on her door, you know. So hey, never. So whatever. So these guys, actually, my Zeta is one of the reasons my Zeta came to America in 1907, was I told the one from Lithuania, because he was about to be conscripted by the Tsar. He said, "Yeah, no way." Right. Yeah. Okay. All these various measures. So things look good. Hope things are opening up, more freedom, all right? Together gave the impression Russia was at long last advancing into a new era of enlightenment and toleration. So now that they're becoming more like the Western Europeans, you know, things are opening up for them. Okay, so now let's talk about Alexander II and his attitude towards the Jews. This first phase, which I told you only lasts for like 8 years. No people held higher hopes for the future than this at this point. 3 million Jews. Remember, we talked about that with under Catherine the Great, you know, like all of a sudden, like 1 million Jews now came under Russian rule. But by this time already, so now the mid-19th century, that was already the very end of the 18th century. By now, we already have 3 million Jews. By the turn of the century, that's going into the 20th century, we're going to have over 5 million Jews. You know, and I know hard, good sized families, right?
Called Peruvian or Fooling.
And they did.
I never heard that expression.
I made it up.
Oh, you made it.
The times are very auspicious now for Jewish emancipation. The Jews, you can imagine, are very excited. Things are going to open up for them. But you have to understand, in the yeshiva world, things are just going along the same way they always have been. And certainly among the Hasidim, I mean, I don't think they could care less about, a lot of them, these changes. You know, again, they just have their lifestyle and they're pursuing it. But to the general population, you know, they weren't Hasidic, or they weren't part of, say, the yeshiva world. So they're really thrilled about all these lovely changes. By the middle of the 19th century, European culture was no longer remote. And I was going to see, right, the universities are open to the Jews. They don't know that certainly the Cantonist system had been abolished. Even if you have to go to the army, it's only for a 6-year period. The typical educated Russian counted the Western humanist tradition as part of his heritage. All right, like they were really very traditional up until the 19th century and even into the early part of the 1800s. But now, like the whole world's opening up to them, and they've certainly, especially through Napoleon and all these ideas of liberty, equality, They've been exposed to that, and they think like a new dawn is opening up for them. One result of this intellectual activity or maturity was a significant decline in the old medieval religious suspicion of the Jew. So in other words, the general Russian population will now look upon the Jews in a different light, not the way the antagonistic notions of what the Jew was like that comes from medieval times. Influential publications pleaded the cause of tolerance. So at this point, there be more and more newspapers are going to be published. Public appeals for brotherhood and understanding were hailed with enthusiasm by Jewish writers. Well, naturally, the Jews are most excited about this. Peasants are no interest, and the nobility. Look, I'm sure some of them were liberal, but the majority of them are very conservative. The truth was that Alexander II shared Nicholas I's distrust of the Jews. So even though he's making all these proclamations and changes, doesn't like the Jews. The notion of granting a full equality, full civil equality, horrified him. When the Minister of the Interior, what would you compare that to here? State Department, maybe? I don't know. Urged that the Pale settlement be abolished, right? Sounds great. The Tsar flatly refused. What's this Nourish cutting? We're going to treat them like everybody else? No, Nor was he influenced by the opinions of high, local, and central administrative officials who urged the removal of residential restrictions. Remember, over time, the Pale settlement was created during Catherine the Great's, reign, towards the end of her reign. And then it gradually actually became more restricted, or even certain parts within the Pale that the Jews couldn't sell, the border regions, certain cities. Alexander had no confidence whatsoever in the honorable qualities of the Jews. He expected them to earn their civil rights through moral improvement. Moral improvement.
What does that?
To give up their Jewishness, become more like the regular, Russian individual. However, the tenor of the time, so at the very end of page 2 now, the tenor of the times demanded some improvement in the Jewish status. Again, this is going to be in those first 8 years of his reign. In 1856, the Tsar, now again, this is at the end of the Crimean War. That's been over. The Tsar issued a ukase, I think that means a decree, okay, abolishing the 6-year period of military cantonment. All right, that those little boys, couldn't be forced, stopped, to serve that awful 6 years away from their families, to be indoctrinated. A former cantonist recalled that I think it's this lovely quote, was to us as the sound of the great shofar, which will awaken the dead on the day of resurrection, So it's like, oh my God, we're being granted our freedom, how fabulous this is. We don't have to, be taken away from our families by force and forced to live in these terrible conditions in the barracks. Throughout the Pale, synagogues were filled to overflowing with Jews who came to observe special Thanksgiving services. I mean, it must have been so amazing. Can you imagine, especially the mothers and fathers, if they had, let's say, a 10 or 12, 11-year-old, they must have been thrilled. Oh my God, I don't have to worry, their child reaches the age of 12 again. And who was it now? But it was the poor people. They were the ones who were literally kidnapped, to serve in these barracks. The decree, coming as it did with the suspension of Russia's 25-year draft, lifted the single most unbearable burden on Jewish life in the Pale. So, I mean, what a relief it was. You didn't have to worry. The authorities were not going to come take your precious little 12-year-old. And I told you we had read this last time. Sometimes they were as young as even 8 or 10. They had a quota to fill. They had each community had to submit a list or the actual bodies of these young boys. So even they sometimes would take a younger child, just to say, well, let's say you needed 50 kids from a particular area, and that's it, that's abolished at this point. And also, even if you are in the army, you only going to serve now 6 years, I suppose, 25 years, that's like a lifetime sentence. Meanwhile,
25 years.
Alexander.
Did they come home?
Yes.
What, did they have
They
family?
said, look, some did return, but some, were baptized, they become Christians. And they forgot, and over so many, yes, they're talking about 31 years. You're taking it as 12-year-old, to 6 years as a canton, and then 25 years as a regular soldier in the army. So, but some did return, again, I'm sure they had to be like re-educated. But never was a terrible situation. Yeah, so we're now at that top paragraph now on page 3. Alexander ordered a reappraisal of the harsh assimilationist laws of his imperial predecessors. Okay, we're trying to force certain conditions on the Jews. Maybe we need to lighten up on them. A reappraisal based on their inefficiency. Okay, remember all those things with they try to convince them that they should become farmers. They try to resettle some of them in Siberia. And they set up, those schools whose purpose was really just to convert, the kids. So some of these things, we're going to have a short period. It's not 8 years, not very long. So, things are more liberal. And he really did all these policies. They were inefficient. They weren't working in any case. He realized that new techniques must be devised for a more practical fusion of the Jewish and Russian people. So he's going to, the main goal is to make the Jews Russians, okay, but you see, you can't force it because people are just resistant to it. Whereas Nicholas had penalized what he called useless categories of Jews by heaping disabilities upon them, Alexander reversed the process by rewarding the more useful elements among the Jews. Who among us are the more useful element? People of superior financial, you have money, right? Or educational potential. Remember, the universities are open to them, and they're excelling in different fields. In 1865, again, this is when the Civil War is going to be ending in the US, okay? A government decree permitted wealthy, we're not talking about just some, a little storekeeper, but wealthy Jewish merchants, university graduates, and skilled artisans to move into the Russian interior, okay? They can leave the Pale of Settlement now. They can move eastward, all right? And now, mingle among the Russians of their caliber, we're not talking about the regular, individual, but, also people of means or educated individuals. It was the Tsar's devout wish that Jewish capital, right, money, might be attracted to Russia's industrial ventures. Okay, so let's use their know-how, their capabilities, right? They're good in business. Let's use them for Russia's benefit. And that Jewish knowledge, again, these are educated ones, might provide valuable services to Russia's backward rural population. Yes, that's going to benefit the poorer Jews. It should benefit Russians. Okay. The irony of that's on the next paragraph. The irony of Alexander's policy was that it opened the Russian interior precisely to those privileged Jews who suffered least from the Pale's condition. So look, this is always all to the good, but most of the people they're stuck in the Pale, they're suffering, they're poor, they're stuck in their little shtetls, or even if they lived in the towns, they're struggling to make ends meet. Jewish peddlers and shopkeepers. Okay, so that's certainly the middle class, but hey, they weren't the ones that he wanted, for whom congestion and competition had become virtually insupportable. In other words, they were really poverty stricken. They were specifically denied permission to live the pale. Just because you had some little shop, didn't mean that you qualified to get permission to move, out of the pale. You had to have demonstrated your business acumen. You already had accumulated your own money. Many of the more desperate moved into the interior anyway, disguising themselves as artisans or professional men. I don't know what the proportion was to the population, but some, there always are some people who to get out of, difficult times, by trying to pass. Your position was most precarious, or that could be discovered, right? What are the repercussions? They live by the sufferance, that means the permission, by the goodwill of police bribery. In other words, you pay them, to throw their back, and we don't exactly have social permission to live here, but just here's some money to do that. Never certain when a knock on the door would signal their arrest and expulsion. Okay, that's the very end now, page 3. Alexander II's emancipation. Now remember, it's in quotations because it wasn't a true emancipation. Continued. All Jews possessing the necessary agricultural or commercial qualifications were granted active and passive suffrage. Vote. Who's voting? But within, within the scheme of these ends of the self-government. In other words, remember he set up these little local what should I call them? The organizations where they could decide on different matters of local interest and go to them. So now Jews are invited to participate in that. In the southern provinces, Jews not only participated in these rural assemblies, occasionally they were appointed to rural office. Wow. So, well, I guess they demonstrated their capabilities, that they were, made good decisions, knew how to run these organizations, and they moved up. Within a few years, a number of Jewish lawyers even attained prominence as members of the page of the Russian bar. Who knew there was a Russian bar in those days? But okay, so some sort of organization of lawyers. The old czarist missionary zeal began at last to decline. Remember, the whole purpose, right? Especially under Nicholas I at that time, was to convert the Jews to Christianity, the Russian Orthodox religion. The bribery, torture, and the economic pressure once employed by the government to encourage Jewish apostasy, that meant conversion to Christianity, now we're gradually abandoned. You can't force somebody, it's not genuine, so they decide we're going to give that up. We're not going to go that path anymore. In 1875, the old conservative crown schools, remember, those crowns, remember we talked about this Max Lillienbaum, who had been hired to open up these schools. Outward appearances, giving some Jews a good education, but really the whole goal ultimately was to convert them. So now these crown schools, right, they're done away with. That's it. They're not, putting on continually this sham for once and for all. The Jews by the thousands now began to matriculate in Russian schools. We're talking about already, we're in 1875. So we're coming to that last quarter of the 19th century, and things are gradually, we'll see what a conflict this became though for the yeshivas, because they didn't want any of their students to go to these schools, and then we'll learn how the government tries to force secular education within the yeshiva system. But again, this is going to happen more later on. Jews by the thousands right now, a bunch of these Russian schools. The new system of, so in other words, they were being exposed now to other thoughts and ideas, and being, just becoming well educated. I mean, these schools, the Russians will obviously they were learning the Russian language, that was the language of instruction. They would have studied math and sciences, I don't know, I guess, and history. But it wasn't anything specifically to convince them, that they needed to convert to be part of Russian society. The new system of quasi, emancipation was infinitely more effective than the old techniques of force and repression. When you try to force somebody into something, there's going to be a reaction. They're going to be resisting, right, to force the change. But if you're doing it in a nice, open way, it's more attractive. And again, we're going to come to it. This is the beginning of the Haskalah, a different way of thinking. Not just learning in a yeshiva setting, in the Cheder, but now we're opening up to other worlds, of thought. And it was also a way, if they're better educated, they became more, they would be able to get, out of the pale, be able to find jobs elsewhere, and just had a broader view of the world. Okay, so that paragraph, the middle paragraph now, both within the pale and beyond, new Jewish communities were established, right? Composed primarily of, so this would be a more middle class, some upper class, mainly of wholesale merchants, industrialists, financiers, academicians, artisans, and discharged veterans. I have to look it up, but Odessa is now going to become a very prominent Jewish city. Lots of liberals were attracted, and a lot of the intelligentsia, I'm talking about the Jews, are going to be going to Odessa. That's the southern part of Russia. Well, it's the Ukraine. I mean, just open up your newspaper and you'll find out about it. Okay, the vocations of these Jews, right, which I cite when you become better educated, you can now move up in society. They brought them into closer contact with Russian life and made them more susceptible to assimilation. So it makes me think even in Germany, I mean, that was the whole point with Mendelssohn and the people came after him. Well, let's educate the Jews, let them learn the German language, be exposed to other thought processes, and then they're going to blend in better with the regular population. A similar thing is going to happen, they think is going to happen here in Russia. Does it really even help us here in the US always? And we were always going to be known as the Jew. You might have a good job in some company someplace, but you think behind the scenes, they're not referring to us as, that Jewish person, that, we always have that identity. So this is so they were quick to adopt the Russian language. Up until now, remember, they're basically taught, especially in the PL, they're speaking Yiddish, and they had a minimum of Polish or Russian to deal with their neighbors, but now they're going to become more fluent, in the language. And they also changed what else? Russian habits of dress and behavior. So, the way, especially the Hasidim, I mean, they've still stuck to that, except for Lubavitch, that old-fashioned way of dress. And that's because they were sort of imitating, because apparently, like in the 1700s, this is how the noblemen would have dressed. So they adopted that custom of dress, but they didn't want to modernize themselves at all. I think they felt like clinging, to still to this day, right? If you're going to dress a certain way, will keep you within that community, right? It sort of became like a barrier. I don't know, a way to protect you, but also the way to keep you in, and it's funny. I'm not sure at what point Lubavitch was old. I mean, wear a hat, but a regular hat. They're not, shrine lord of it. What'd you say the name of that thing is? The Gerber Chassid? What's that like called? Your shrine. Someone said in the class here last time. I forget what it's called. But whatever. But the other, among the Misnagdim, I mean, they're not dressing like this anymore. Actually, if you ever look at pictures after a brilliant, I have some things at home. I was gonna say yeshiva students. Of course, the pictures I have are probably from the 1920s or something. They're very modern looking. Those kids sitting in the yeshiva, they're wearing regular clothes or they have caps. Used to have caps. And I'm sure if you pass somebody on the street, you would not necessarily, although they claim you can always tell what Jews look like, but we actually have all kinds of different coloration depending where we come from, or whatever. So okay, so this quasi emancipation fostered an intense feeling of national pride among the Jews. They were feeling very good about themselves. We're now being accepted by Russian society. We're able to move up. We're able to improve ourselves. Jews who had once been compelled to live in the seclusion of the Pale Settlement were now unrestrained in their warm affections for the language and culture of Mother Russia. I don't know any of those, German Jews who came to live in the U.S. There was very proud German heritage. But any Russian Jews who look back with favor upon that they were Russians? No. That's all right. Yeah. Right. All right, let's try and do one more. Russian Jews had never been particularly concerned about the attitudes of their Christian neighbors. We'll do what we want. They can do what they want, we have nothing to do with them, Now, as many of them emerged from their isolation, they became quite sensitive to non-Jewish opinion. They were also increasingly conscious of their own dignity. In the 1860s, government representatives often appeared at celebrations in Jewish schools, at farewell dinners, even at occasional bar mitzvahs. Listen, don't you go someplace here in the US and you're invited to somebody, some kid's bar mitzvah, or even a wedding, and there always are some non-Jews here. I guess those are the people, the people who are making the wedding, the business. Jews in turn were occasionally admitted into Russian social circles and Russian clubs, in their eagerness to bridge the gulf separating them from their Christian neighbors. Many Russian Jews interpreted a friendly gesture on the part of non-Jews as evidence of a complete change of heart. As it turned out, Mother Russia was still determined to distinguish between her children and her stepchildren. Of course, in Jew, we are the stepchildren. Now, we might have been living there already. Don't forget, the Pale Settlement was former Poland. I mean, we've been living, in Eastern Europe now for hundreds of years, but we are not accepted. We are different, and and maybe in certain circles. Look, even in Germany, that's what happened. At the beginning of those early days, the Jews thought that their people finally accepted. We're talking about a minority, a very small group of people who were actually really genuinely accepted into this secular world. But when it comes right down to it, and we don't even hear. I mean, I feel quite comfortable living here in the United States, but there's definitely this undercurrent, and when things don't turn out so good in life, so very easily anti-Jewish sentiment will rise to the surface, right? We'll just start the next, but we have a few more minutes. Now we're going to come to the period of reaction. It can only be good for so long. Now the tide is going to turn. Okay. In the year 1863. So what's the catalyst? Why did Alexander, the second now change his policy towards the Jews? Poland. There's nothing. There were some Jews who participated, but it was, the Polish. probably more of people more in the upper class, although I'm sure they convinced some of the lower classes. They revolted against Polish rule.
Against us.
Against Russian rule, sorry, right. They wanted their independence. The uprising was long and bloody, and it ultimately failed. The end result was to release the Tsar Alexander's long dormant instinct for reaction. Okay. Remember, I told you he was always sort of an ambivalent person in his thoughts and ideas. So, but now he's going to turn totally against any reform. He was convinced that what Russia needed was a firm hand and a clear-cut policy of strict conservatism. The period following the Polish uprising stood out in great contrast to the first 8 years of Alexander II's reign. All reforms were abruptly halted. The third section, okay, this is the secret police, KGB in this way. The third section of the Ministry of the Interior was revived and was ordered to hunt down the liberals and all their associates in all corners of the empire. Okay, that's enough of this. Enough of this talk of having equal rights and a say in the government. That's it. We're going to put the kebabs on it. The secret police were particularly harsh with Russia's national minorities. Well, that's us also, as they were all under a cloud of suspicion as a result of Poland's disloyalty. Alexander and his advisors now gave increasing attention to Slavophilism. One reason this was a love of Slavic culture, that means Russian culture, right? A nativist philosophy of Russian Orthodoxy, Church, and Russian nationalism. This philosophy rejected the ideals of the West and all the trappings of liberalism. So those are those key components of now Russian Tsarist, a policy, that we're going to stress the church again, all right? The loyalty to the nation, right? And loyalty to us as Slavs. All of a sudden, this becomes a new idea that we're going to gain acceptance. Actually, that's part of when World War I breaks out in 1914. That's part of the reason why Russia, first it was a thing within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the Germans got involved. Well, and the Russians have to get involved also. They had to defend the Slavs, talking about Serbia, Herzegovina, Divina, which were, these were all part of Austria-Hungary at the time, but these were fellow Slavs, ethnic wise, they were part of that whole Russian society. They will do one more. The Jews, the least popular of the empire's ethnic minorities, took the full brunt. You can imagine, we always managed to suffer the most of this furious reaction. Though the urge for Russification was strong among the new Jewish intelligentsia and industrial aristocracy. I mean, they had done very well for themselves, they think that they're being accepted now. The broad masses, so most of the Jews, had responded very little to the reforms of Alexander's early years. Well, it didn't benefit them in any way. So what was there to respond to? The few gratuities offered them thus far had been insufficient to fill them with a burning desire to feud with the Russian people. The government was little interested in explanations, however, and now found the excuse it needed to reverse its policies in the emergence of a significant Jewish middle class in the interior. There's another reason, there's always a reason, had also aroused the jealousy of the Russian petite bourgeoisie, meaning that means the regular, the Russian merchant, the owner of a small business, who are these upstarts, these Jews are coming in here and they're trying to take over our territory. These Russian small businessmen and white collar workers who had suffered very little from Jewish competition. Really they were doing okay, but in their minds, they were blaming the Jews. But their frustration when they did not share in the Russian industrial boom. I mean, anybody who tries to better themselves finds that they can't, right? So you grow angry and frustrated, then you unleash, a lot of negative sentiment. And this was all directed against the Jews, When we stood out, we were still different, we were still, observing, we were not converting, we still had our own specific religion. And now all of a sudden, again, those who excelled, it didn't matter, but to those, they're talking about the Russians, those Russian businessmen were still right forward, they weren't, they were better perhaps than they had in the past, but they weren't all of a sudden becoming big shots. So now they're resentful of the few Jews who are around them, who seem to be managing and doing all right. Alexander had originally encouraged Jewish settlement beyond the Pale, precisely to profit from their enterprise, right? Good Jewish couple, they were doing well, he wanted them to come in. But now, however, the very success of this scheme provided the rationale for ending it. The Russian middle class, it was decided, had to be protected, and protected from the cutthroat Jewish competition. I mean, we were trying to earn a living and do as best we could. They were also, but they viewed it, that it was taking something away from the Christian population. So now all their anger, as they say, their frustration, and not being sufficiently successful, they're going to blame the Jews, for. I think I'll pause here, okay? We'll continue next time. And then I'll return to those original sheets. So if you have still the sheets from the one that says the Haskalah, so bring those with you, okay? Because we're going to go back to these sheets. And then you'll see you don't have those. I only have one left. So I'm going to I'll ask Andrea to write off a few more copies. Okay, so she saves everything. I don't in her computer. So if I need a few more copies, I'll ask her to do that on our behalf. Okay, all should be well. Enjoy your last day of Hanukkah. And there always should be good things hallowed for us, wherever we live.
The name of the other hat was Spodik.
That's very good. Thank you. That's pleasant. That's just the Gerer Hasidim who wear that type of a hat? I don't know if there are any other.
I have to look at Rabbi Google.
Yeah, that's pleasant. Well, at least they don't take up so much space like those Stribels.
Those Stribels are not cheap, by the way.
No, I heard that. I think it's $30. Not more.
I have a nephew.
Be well, everybody.
Bye.
Hope to see you guys next week. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed your breakfast.
I don't think he's giving it. I think it was for sale. Oh, my goodness, you forgot something?
No, I didn't, because I thought there was gonna be the rabbi's class, but
I think it was
is there the
there.
rabbi's class today?
Now,
What?
now will be the rabbi.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So you can.
Nobody's here, so,
Well, we're finished at 10 up. He's gonna start at 11.
Yeah,
oh, is that 10 to 11?
11 to 12.
11 to 12.
How are you doing?
No, I mean, I know the class is at 11 to 12, but I
Oh,
watched
okay.
that whole thing, so I don't.
I'm tired.
Oh, really? There is no.
I should not.
See, you're not using a walker anymore. That's a good sign.
Well, I usually, I just use the walk of going to shoot for security, but other than that, I can.